On February 24th, Russia began a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Military experts deemed it the largest conventional military attack on a sovereign state in Europe since World War II. This invasion is an escalation of war that has been in the making since 2014. Lives are being lost as the world watches. The question is being asked, though, are world leaders doing enough to stop the aggressor? In the past 14 days, hundreds of Ukrainian people have died at the hands of Russian armed forces, showing no mercy, not even for women and children. Over 800 Ukrainians have been seriously injured, and more than 2 million of them have fled since Russia began its invasion. On many recorded messages, the Ukrainian President Zelensky has begged the world for help as he and his countrymen display resilience in not backing down or surrendering. He says, "We will stay and fight because this is our country. After all, it's their home." While many expected a full-force military clapback on Russia from the United States, the United Kingdom, and other world leaders, what we are seeing instead are heavy sanctions against Russia. These sanctions are pinning down the Russian economy, while Russian elites, athletes, and even opera singers are receiving the cold shoulder. But is it really enough to stop the Russian president and his military from plowing down the once beautiful cities of Ukraine with hardly any reason, but that he suspects Nazis are in charge of that country? Tonight, our discussion is Russia invades Ukraine, a diplomat's perspective. And our very special guests are Sarah Dixon, the British High Commissioner, and Usha Pitts, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. We'll see you on the other side of this break. So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
at the conference, the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Yeah, that's, we are trying to deliver all information that we have to the world, because all these crimes that Russia is doing here, the world has to see it, know it, and punish Russia for what Russian soldiers are doing, because every single Russian person is responsible for what's going on and what has happened.
Welcome back to On the Record. Tonight's discussion takes us to the Ukraine. Our topic is Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, a diplomatic perspective. That was Ukrainian journalist Dmytro Maruchuk with his take on what is taking place in Ukraine. Our very special guests tonight are Sarah Dixon, she's the British High Commissioner, and Usha Pitts, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires. Ms. Dixon became the British High Commissioner to the Bahamas in August of 2019 and has served in the British diplomatic service for more than 20 years. Chargé d'Affaires Usha Pitts began her tour at the U.S. Embassy in the Bahamas on New Year's Day in 2021 having served at diplomatic posts in Russia, Cuba, Italy, Austria, Panama, and Brazil, to name a few. Ladies, welcome to On the Record. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
This is a little different discussion for us because we are talking tonight about a global issue and an issue that's happening on the other side of the world, literally, but certainly has a cause and effect for us. First of all, we started with Ukrainian journalist Dmytro Maruchuk, who says that he and other journalists there are showing the world what Russia is doing, as Russia must be punished. Your response to what we heard from him?
Well, if I start, I think what he says is absolutely valid, which is journalists are the people that show the world what's happening on the ground in places. And Ukrainian journalists at the moment are under incredible pressure and are seeing terrible things. There was a bombing yesterday of a maternity hospital, which Russia is trying to deny happened, but the journalists were there, they've taken the footage and they're able to show that to the world, and that's really important. And that the world supports them is also just crucial at these times.
Madam Chargé?
Yeah, no, I'm very sensitive to this as well because we see what's happened inside Russia as Putin has clamped down on the media, closed down independent media outlets. So those independent voices that are so important have gradually been pushed out of Russia. And so as a result, Russians themselves don't necessarily have a real picture of the tragedy that is unfolding on their border. So yeah, I support that very much. And regarding the issue of punishment, absolutely, the world needs to take notice and to take steps to punish Putin for his irresponsible behavior regarding Ukraine.
You would have completed a tour of duty in Russia. Give us a picture or help us to understand what it is like inside Russia, because I think for a lot of us, or for the rest of the world, there was the former Soviet Union and there was communism, and then that ended with the Cold War, and you thought, naive or not, that Russia was a different place. But we are learning that a lot of the pre-Cold War things that happened in Russia are now existing. You talk about, or you see where they have shut down all the independent media. It's just the state-run television. Vladimir Putin himself, a former KGB agent. And for me, I'm looking at all of this and I'm thinking, is this the Russia of the Mikhail Gorbachev?
Well, you say it might have been naive of us to think that every country would be as successful as Ukraine was and make that transition to democracy, which Ukraine did back in 1991. But not everybody managed to do it. And so when I was posted to Russia as a young diplomat, this was some time ago, we still thought there was a chance, right? We thought that Russia was heading in the right direction. We thought that democracy would really take root. President Putin back in that day, we had high hopes for his potential to preside over free and fair elections and to turn over power to a legitimately elected successor. Now, that didn't happen, and we were wildly disappointed, not only because what it means for Russians themselves, but also for what it means for the world, because what's happened is Russia has kind of fallen back, retrenched into this tradition of totalitarianism. And what that's meant is that, things like this happen. And I'm not just talking about this most recent situation in Ukraine, but we saw it in Ukraine a few years ago in 2014 when Crimea was invaded by Russia. We saw it in Georgia when Putin invaded Georgia. So it's, these are the terrible effects of what happens when there isn't a transition to democracy.
Madam High Commissioner, I know that you would have served a period of time or a tour with NATO, and NATO continues to be, in many instances, the crutch, I think, that Vladimir Putin is using for this invasion. Help us to understand what seems to be his anxiety or his issue with NATO and Ukraine.
So, first of all, I think any fear that he is pretending to have of NATO is purely pretense. When I served in NATO was a time when we started to invite Russia into all the discussions. So we would have NATO +1 meetings, we'd have the NATO-Russia Council. We were talking about how we could bring peace and security to Europe. We had treaties that allowed us to monitor each other's troops on the borders, and Russia pulled out of that. And they pulled out of that because they were amassing troops on various borders of various countries in Europe. And it's because they still have this vision, I believe, of some kind of greater Russia and pretensions over sovereign nations' territories, and they want to redefine the borders, and they want to seem to be wanting to do it in blood by invading, by committing, war crimes as they do it. So this is not a situation where the kind of hopes that Usha talked about have been realised, where we were hoping that there would be peace and stability and friendship from this change.
The Ukrainian President Zelensky has been calling for help from around the world. Will we see the kind of help that he has been asking for? We have seen the imposition of sanctions, but he's talking about real tangible help, military help, more help. Will we see that happening? I mean, at what point is the world going to come to the aid of the Ukrainians?
Right. Well, I mean, President Zelensky has a priority, and that is to maintain the integrity of his country. And so, of course, I would do the same as he's doing right now. Call on every possible ally, corner, friendship, relationship to defend his country. So I absolutely understand that. Regarding U.S. assistance to Ukraine, we have donated over close to $1 billion this past year. And our assistance, this is in security assistance, and that is meant to support Ukraine, to give them tools to fight off Russia. I think it's really admirable, impressive to see how the Ukrainian people have absolutely stood up to this invasion, and quite successfully so far. I think, I commend President Zelensky for that. As for additional military support, I don't quite know how this is going to go. I mean, that is the vagaries of war. But for right now, the United States is resisting, and President Biden has said we will not intervene militarily at this point because of the possible ramifications, the possible outcomes.
Which brings me then to my next question, because for the public, we look and we wonder, why not put boots on the ground? And I guess that's going to be my next question. What would be some of the ramifications for putting American boots on the ground? I'm going to come to the UK in a moment, but what would be some of the ramifications of that?
Right. Well, we have to remember that a couple of things, right? One, that Russia is a nuclear power. So that is a game changer, and everybody has to keep that in mind because of what it means. I think we all know that if there's a nuclear confrontation, nobody wins. There's not a winner there. So we have to keep that in mind. We also have to keep in mind that nobody can get inside the mind of Putin right now. And his actions show a certain recklessness, a certain inability to rationally calculate what is going on in the world. And so, we have to be very, very careful about that. And then finally, we have to talk about the legal ramifications, and that's really where my colleague is going to be able to speak better about this, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And so the United States does not have a legal obligation to intervene on their behalf. And that is also a calculation that I think Putin is keeping in mind. He's wondering whether the United States will get involved. But for right now, we don't have a NATO obligation to do that.
And from a particularly hypothetical situation, had Ukraine been a member of NATO, how would this have played out differently?
So for NATO members, and I think all of the membership of NATO are clear on this, an attack on one is attack on all, and we work together as an alliance. Part of the reason that Ukraine is not a member of NATO is partly because NATO is a defensive organisation by its nature, and we knew the problems that existed for countries on Russia's border. So talks about how we work those problems through, diplomatic solutions, and then allowing Ukraine to be its own sovereign nation through training, through support, has definitely been what we've all been trying to work towards. There wasn't some rush by NATO to say, Ukraine, come with us, to upset Russia. This, that's just an absolute fallacy when Russia suggests that NATO was somehow threatening to it. our support for Ukraine has been about allowing Ukraine to be a sovereign, independent nation that decides its own future. So we equally have provided training, we've provided defensive equipment, and we continue to do that. Just yesterday, my Defence Secretary was talking about more assistance of defensive systems to Ukraine, because we are cautious of not escalating this. And sometimes the best thing that the Allies can do is try and de-escalate those tensions when Russia is threatening things or raising issues, to actually say, you know, let's be realistic about this and let's not escalate this, because actually our main objective is to get them out of the country and Ukraine again a free nation.
But at this point, or do you think at this point, is the aid, the arms, the funds, is that enough for the Ukrainian people at this point to even stave off or continue to stave off this attack from Russia?
Well, I mean, like Sarah said, the UK has supported Ukraine. The United States, many other countries around the world have supported Ukraine, both with physical equipment, but also with their words, with symbolic support. It is very, very important that the world band together to support Ukraine, however way they can, including the Bahamas, right? So I think that's a really important point that we have to get across.
One of the things that the United States and other countries, the UK and others, and even we see a lot of multinational companies now joining the sanctions bandwagon. A lot of companies in Russia have stopped, or that have interest in Russia, have stopped doing business. And we look at sanctions, and those of us who don't understand sanctions, you know, it just looks like strong words to us. And we go, you know, is that really enough to stop an aggression? But help us to understand what sanctions at the level that we are seeing can do to Russia, and can, you know, what both of your governments are hoping these sanctions will do.
So just to say, the sanctions package against Russia, and some of it applies to Belarus, who have been supporting Russia in this, is more sanctions than we have ever passed against a country. So it is the strongest package of sanctions. And every day, in fact, there are new announcements from the British government of additional sanctions as we pass legislation, as we respond to the situation on the ground and try and make that even stronger. So, for instance, Russian banks can't transfer money through the UK. We've removed them from a system called SWIFT, which allows you to transfer money. So that's instantly cut off a way that they can move money around the world. We've sanctioned oligarchs, so the very wealthy Russians who've done well from this, quite frankly, not democratic country, as Usha was saying. We've sanctioned and frozen their assets so that they hopefully will be putting political pressure on Putin to stop this barbaric action. We've done other things such as ban flights into the UK. We've seized some aeroplanes, that kind of thing. And every day almost we announce something new to put that constant pressure to show that this is wrong and make it stop, and hopefully de-escalate the actual military violence.
From the United States' perspective?
Yeah, well, I'll take this opportunity to talk a little bit more about what's happening inside Russia as a result of these sanctions. And by the way, Jerome, I totally get the whole thing about how sanctions are confusing, even for those of us who deal with this stuff. It's hard to get a handle on it. But these measures that Sarah outlined, right? You don't let them fly, you don't let them bank. Those are what these sanctions package include. And so there were a lot of critics at the beginning of this effort to shut down Russia's access to the world, who said, "Oh well, you know, sanctions, they don't do anything. Look, these guys have tanks; they're invading. So what are sanctions going to do?" And those of us who sort of believe in this kind of these non-violent steps understood that sanctions take time. So here we are 2 weeks into the invasion, and we're seeing the effects of it inside Russia. The ruble is collapsing. It's lost half its value. That's, you know, effectively taking half of every Russian's wealth right out of their pocket. And that's causing a terrible toll. They cannot travel. So, you know, all these Russians who take advantage of educational opportunities in Sarah's country, in my country, around the world, they cannot go. And you see the inflation going up, prices skyrocketing at the same time. And more than anything, you see that Russia is gradually becoming a pariah state. And this whole thing, 2 weeks in, is already starting to take a toll. And I believe that the longer it lasts, the harder it's going to get for Putin to justify this reckless action.
I want to talk a little bit more about inside Russia and how, possibly the tide could turn with all of this, with those sanctions. Ladies, we are going to take a break right here. And when we return, our discussion continues on Russia invades Ukraine, a diplomatic perspective. You're watching On the Record. We'll be back right after this. So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference,
the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV. And we're back. You're watching On the Record. I'm joined by Sarah Dixon, the British High Commissioner, and Usha Pitts, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires. Once again, here is Ukrainian journalist Dmytro Maruchak.
Refugees, mainly refugees, the women and kids. And all men, they cannot leave countries, so they will stay and they will fight. So many of them left to the western part of country, where it's more safe than here near Kyiv, but I don't think about that. I just here and I'm do what I can.
The realities of living in a war-torn country. I spoke to Maruchak. He had been without power for 5 days. We couldn't even do a Zoom call. We were able to get that video from him and just talking to him and trying to get a sense of what it must be like in the country. He says, he's doing what he can. Mainly women and children are able to leave. We see the images of the refugees that are moving across the border. People are being uprooted from their lives as they know it, but are still resilient in many ways. We still see the stories of those who are staying and fighting. How long do you think the Ukraine can hold off Putin and his army with his armed forces in places like Kyiv and other major cities, when we see the assault continuing and obviously the firepower and the manpower and the resources that Russia has? How long can the Ukrainians hold them off and continue to hold that country?
I think we've heard the president say, and the journalist there said something similar, which is Ukrainians have something to fight for. And their heart and soul is in protecting their homeland, protecting their families, making sure that their towns and cities remain under Ukrainian control. And they seem to have a real purpose, a real something to fight for. Whereas when you see images from newscasters of the Russian troops invading, there seems to be confusion even in Russia as to whether this is happening or not. And then there seems to be confusion from the troops as to where they are and what they're doing. There does, in news reports I've seen, that there seems to be a reluctance from some of the Russian forces and some of the Russian people to admit or understand what's going on, whereas the Ukrainian people see it every day. They know that their young people and their elderly and the other vulnerable are flooding out of the country as refugees. They know that anyone who can fight is staying to fight. They can see it in the streets happening, attacks on universities, attacks on town squares, on hospitals. And it seems to me that they have an incredible spirit to protect their country from this invasion. And that's partly why we were talking in the previous segment about that defensive support that we've been supplying. And yesterday we announced, for example, more anti-tank missiles, different kinds of handheld anti-tank missiles that will support them in their incredibly brave efforts.
Do you think President Putin and the Russians underestimated the Ukrainians and their resolve to hold on to their country?
Well, I think they underestimated a lot of things. Principal among them, the ability of the Russian armed forces to quickly take over Ukraine. They had a fairly easy go of it with Crimea in 2014. So I think they thought, well, we'll do the same thing again. We'll basically invade Ukraine, grab some land, and it will be fine. You know, nobody will notice. But that is, of course, not what happened. And we have to admire the fortitude of the Ukrainian people who simply are not willing to give up their country to an invading force. And, you know, it's not just the men, it's the women. You see all Ukrainians picking up arms to defend their country. It's amazing to see. That said, we can't deny that Russia has tremendous amounts of human resources. They've got a lot of people in their military, and they also, however outdated or failing their equipment, they certainly have a lot of equipment. So Russia, however slowly, however incompetently, is advancing on the capital, and it does make me go cold to think about what will happen if they manage to surround and invade the capital city.
We also see, you know, some of the atrocities that have taken place within in the last 2 weeks. Ukrainian children, maternity wards have been bombed, even though, as you have said, and we've seen Russia has denied it. Also, that Russia may be targeting civilian areas. Do you think that a part of the strategy is a provocation of the US and the UK? By President Putin? Do you think he's trying to provoke the United States and the UK and NATO to come to war with him?
I think Usha said it best earlier, which is trying to get inside the head of Vladimir Putin at the moment, is virtually impossible. And he clearly is the dictator that's running the show. But you are right to say that what we're seeing is war crimes, atrocities. 38 countries have already referred what's happening in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court because we believe that what he's doing is illegal under any measure of international law, under any laws of war, under the UN Charter. I mean, it's entirely unjustifiable, the actions that they've been taking in Ukraine, which is a sovereign member of the United Nations. We need to remember this. One thing that I think is true of the allies and the countries around the world, all 141 of us that condemned it in the UN, is we're not fooled, and we're also not going to let him play games with us or, force our hand. It's our job as an alliance, it's our job as countries working together to make sure that we force his hand so he stops this action.
Yeah, I don't think he anticipated what he got. I think he tried to pull a fast one, essentially, grab the land, claim it for Russia, return to whatever crazy ideas he has about a greater Russia motherland, and instead what he did was raise the ire of every civilized country out there. And he's got a lot more on his plate, I think, than he anticipated.
When you talk about getting into the head of Putin, or even trying to understand, which nobody seems to be able to do at this point, how do you begin to even negotiate or get to the table for any kind of diplomatic discussions when you're dealing with a Putin who is irrational, who is paranoid, who has a very small inner circle, who's not listening? How do you even begin to get to the table to discuss diplomacy in a situation like this?
So there have been some diplomatic talks, I think, in the past fortnight. I mean, let's remember, it's only the military invasion started a fortnight ago, and foreign ministers met most recently. And for Ukraine, it's very hard to negotiate with a country that is invading, not respecting ceasefires that you think you've agreed, acting in a way that's against international law. That's not an ideal scenario in which to try and make progress on the diplomatic fronts. What I think is true is the Ukrainian president has consistently said, let's have a ceasefire. Let's talk about what the issues are. And so I think there's a genuine will on the Ukrainian part to work this through. And I think Russia needs to back up that genuine will as well in those talks.
Yeah, I mean, Russia has been given every available diplomatic avenue to get out of this, to get himself out of this, and he's failed to take it. We've had heads of state speak with him. My own president, President Biden, spoke with him, gave him an off-ramp. And the fact that he did not take advantage of those off-ramps when he had a chance is very, very worrisome. Because what happens is once you get in a war situation, life becomes very unpredictable, and unpredictability in a war situation leads to lives lost. So that is the fear when you reject the fundamental rules of the game, the fundamental global order like Putin has.
Ladies, we're going to pause here for another break in the show. If you are enjoying this conversation, stay with us. On the Record will continue right after this break. So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference,
the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On the Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
Tonight we are discussing Russia invades Ukraine, a diplomat's perspective. Welcome back to On the Record. As we went into the last break, we were talking really about how do you have a diplomatic conversation, or how do you speak diplomacy to a man like Putin, who is very unpredictable, even paranoid, isolated himself. The images we see of him are that of a paranoid man. I mean, he's in the room and everybody else is separated from him. But on the other side, you see a president, the president of Ukraine, who is projecting a much different image. When you look at the two men, and the world is looking at this, and your countries are looking at this, at what point when do you now go beyond just the diplomacy? Or is there a point when you get beyond just the diplomacy? When you realize that the efforts at diplomacy aren't working, when the situation is worsening, is there a line in the sand that these major countries, these NATO countries are going to say, okay, enough. We now have to intervene. Is there a line in the sand that can happen? Or at what point do we know that we're at that line?
I understand the question entirely, and I understand why you and your audience would be really interested in that. I know that my Defence Secretary has said a few times, we're not drawing lines in the sand. We're not saying, if you do this, then the follow military action will happen, because part of our strategy is to de-escalate that kind of rhetoric from Russia, de-escalate when they talk about nuclear weapons and they threaten craziness that will really just, I think Usha said it brilliantly earlier, is a zero-sum game that nobody wins. So I would say diplomacy is happening. Diplomacy is an important part of it, but we've gone well beyond diplomacy. The sanctions packages, make no mistake, are having huge ramifications in Russia and for Russians, and putting that pressure on diplomatically in multilateral organisations like the UN and other bodies, working together on these issues is so important. And it's not just about diplomatic talks where, perhaps there's stalemate or it's going to take a while to progress. In the meantime, we're doing all these other things to make sure that Russia and its kind of barbaric invasion of Ukraine ceases as quickly as possible, and with as little loss of life as possible. I think that has to be the strategic objective in this.
Usha, in the early, I mean, even prior to the invasion, there were some pockets within the United States, some groups who were outright and publicly giving their support to Putin. Do you think, or has that emboldened him? You think in any way people have come forward and support? Has that? Do you think that has that emboldened him?
Well, God knows what Putin is looking at. I don't know what he sees or what he thinks. I think, and regarding the voices inside the United States that support Putin, they are few, and most of them also didn't expect Russia to actually go ahead and invade a sovereign nation, because who would defend that? Anybody who is currently defending that action has been completely sidelined. So luckily, I think those voices have been dampened. And I do want to say, just per your question about diplomacy, we find we're both professional diplomats, so we always find
that's your job.
we see opportunities for diplomacy no matter what is happening. We could be on the brink of nuclear war, and diplomacy sometimes saves us from that. And I think that even American military leaders are the first to say, listen, we never close the door to diplomacy. It's important to keep that communication open. And I think you saw it from President Biden, who is himself a consummate diplomat. His willingness to call Putin, get him on the phone, and make sure that he understood exactly what the United States was contemplating and exactly what we knew about his plans to invade Ukraine. That was very important. That is also a form of diplomacy that my own president is engaging in. So, yeah, we will always leave the door open to talk.
And do you think the public misses that sometimes? That, we hear or you see things happening and people go, well, why are they still talking? Well, why do you need diplomacy? Go in and do something, for Christ's sake.
In fact, in many ways, diplomacy is all about the talking, because if you don't talk, how can you understand what the other side is thinking, what they think is happening? Because perception, you were talking earlier about this, and perception of what's happening, and talking to a Ukrainian journalist opens up your perception of what's happening. In fact, our Secretary of State met in DC yesterday to talk face to face, because that can help as well. All this Zoom calling and telephones doesn't necessarily bring it together quite so tightly. So I think Usha's absolutely right. Diplomacy will continue throughout this. And it does appear that Ukraine and Russia are trying to find any space they can to talk. So I think supporting that through the multilateral system is really important for us as well.
Anytime we're in a war and anytime we're in a conflict at this level, there is economic fallout. People are already seeing a rise in prices at the pumps. And once fuel goes up, once gas goes up, everything else goes up. And in a global economy that is still reeling from a COVID-19 pandemic, that has put so many people out of work, that has really hit us so hard, we're just beginning now to see our way clear. Economically, what can we expect, even on this side of the world? What can a prolonged conflict in the Ukraine mean for us economically?
My Prime Minister and I'm pretty sure your President will have said similar things, and I've seen reporting here which is accurate to say that with economic sanctions, that economic pain can be wider than just the country that you're targeting. We all recognise that. You've hit the nail on the head. Fuel prices will go up, and if fuel prices go up, there's other implications, usually with food prices as well. Ukraine is a very important agricultural grower, and their agriculture season is bound to be disrupted. So these price rises will affect us all. And that's partly why we've constantly said the whole world needs to condemn this action and stop it as quickly as possible. Because the longer that goes on, the longer that those price rises and those difficulties will affect all of us. So working together to stop this as quickly as possible will help reduce those impacts. But make no mistake, there will be economic impacts for all of us, all over the world.
Yeah, that's true. We've already seen the price at the pump go up, and that, of course, hits everybody, no matter what what echelon of society you're in. So it's that's rough. I think the Biden administration has already thought about ways to kind of ease that particular pain. We do have a U.S. petroleum reserve that the administration will tap into to help kind of take the sting off the worst price hikes. You will see over time that new oil drills get underway. It takes about 7 months or so for that to happen. So there is some relief, but I think longer term, there are some really fundamental issues here when we're just talking about energy. And, one is that we have to wean ourselves off oil, period, and Russian oil in particular, right? And then more longer term, we have to invest more in renewables and make sure that that no one country can wield that kind of power over the rest of the world. And by the way, I think that's an important point to remember that there is hardship in the world right now across the board when it comes to inflation and energy prices. And that, by the way, is on President Putin. This is not anybody else's fault but his. He has brought us to this point. So I think it's clear to put blame where blame is due.
Those sanctions in Russia are taking root, and we talk about the collapse of the ruble and inflation skyrocketing. And do you think those sanctions are going to lead to action by the Russian people who, for all intents and purposes, don't understand what's going on due to the controlled media, don't see the war like the rest of us do, and don't completely understand? Do you think, or is there going to be a point, you think, where the Russian people are going to say, wait a minute, hold on, we're suffering and we don't understand why?
Well, I mean, I hope there comes a point where the Russian people say, no mas, let's end this. I mean, that's what I really hope for. And when I say end this, I mean end Putin's regime, end his totalitarian control over the country, and return to a day when Russia can have free and fair elections and choose their own leadership, because then they will know what's going on in their country. So, I really think that in some ways that is the best case scenario for ending this conflict, is that the Russian people themselves say, we're not going to do this anymore, Putin. You have dragged us into a situation that we didn't ask for and that we didn't necessarily know about, right? Well, I hope the best for them. I hope that's where this goes, and not to a darker place.
I'm an historian. I am an historian in many ways, and with the ending of the Cold War and the dismantling of the former Soviet Union, and even unification of Germany, and those movements were driven by the people.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was when the people of those countries were fed up and were tired of the suffering and were tired of the things that came along with the communism and other systems of government that they said, no more, we are done. Mm-hmm. But in those, for me, and I'm a 90s boy, an 80s, 90s boy, it was a domino effect across Europe and other places. But, it was a different time, and there were other things that led to that. Do you see that happening again? I mean, I asked you that in so many ways, but, it was almost as if it started in one country and it moved across, with Russia now being sort of that sole country right now, with a few countries around it supporting. But is it possible to get to that place again?
But if you think about why we're where we are at the moment, it was Ukraine that had its own moment of realization when Russian-backed Ukrainian president was trying to stop the signing of an agreement which would have opened up their economy with the European Union. And the people said, no, not in my name. We do not want this. And they ousted their president and have chosen one that more represents the views of the majority. And in a democracy, that's what counts, is that your government is representing the views of the people. And I do think there has been this incredible control by Russia of state media that means that Russian people have been exposed to constant lies, let's call it what it is, lies by the Russian government as to what Russia is doing and how it's doing it. And, I agree with Usha. If there's a way of cutting through that and making a difference to the way Russian people view their country and are able to take control of their own destiny, which is definitely what we say for Ukraine. This isn't about Usha and I telling Ukraine what to do or what they want. This isn't about the Bahamas, telling Ukraine what to do. This is about the Ukrainian people deciding whether they want to apply for membership of international organisations, how they want their economy to run.
Russian television gives stories of genocide against Russians in the Ukraine, and the rise of Nazis and persecution of Russians. Is there any empirical evidence of that anywhere?
It almost doesn't bear repeating, because I'm afraid that even by talking about it, we somehow legitimize the garbage that Russian state media puts out, right? I think it's important, though, to recognize how evil it really is, because one of the narratives is that Russia somehow needs to denazify Ukraine, as if that had anything to do with what is going on inside Ukraine. And I like I said, I don't want to dignify it by giving it any more playtime than that, but I think anybody who knows what's going on in the world, who follows events at all, knows that Ukraine is a thriving democracy, and that is what threatens Putin.
And you know, the unfortunate thing, it's like, you know, with any lie, that if you tell it long enough, you start to believe it, you know, yourself. So I think that may be where, you know, the Russian people may find themselves with a lot of the information that they are receiving. And finally, just as we go to the break, that is the danger of ending independent media, or putting a clamp on independent media, because the people of Russia are really only hearing one set of information that's being put out, you know, by state TV.
Did you see what Putin did? I mean, he closed down all independent media. He's locked up the opposition. He shuts down that because he knows that that's a threat to his deluded worldview, and he doesn't want people to hear what's really happening.
You know, but that said, there are videos getting out. People have managed to get videos out of the country and so forth, and we see that thousands of Russians are protesting because they are feeling the pinch, and many of them did not want this war.
Well, I was going to say, even in the early days, there were many who were arrested because they were anti-war protesters.
Correct.
So there are groups in Russia who are opposed to this.
You know that the Russian has now passed a law saying that you cannot even refer to the conflict as a war. It's incredible the effects of a country that does not have freedom of the press
and freedom of speech. Very important. Ladies, we are at the point of our final break. We have just a few more things to talk about here on The Record. Our topic tonight: Russia invades Ukraine, a diplomat's perspective. We are back with some closing points right after this. So the project really pays itself back.
Correct.
They set up
At the conference,
the school.
As a journalist, I always have to focus on the facts, and sometimes that means going to investigate for myself. On The Record, Thursdays at 8 p.m. right here on RTV.
You know, the biggest fear and concern, personally, it's not to see my daughter. I managed her to leave Ukraine, and she's now in Riga. And a general concern is that is to lose the country, because Russia just want to destroy our countries. They've been doing that for hundreds of years, and they've been preparing this war since Soviet Union collapsed. So.
Welcome back. You're watching On The Record. Once again, that was Ukrainian journalist Dmytro Maruchak, who is currently in Ukraine, in the city of Kyiv. Ladies, Dmytro says the greatest fear of the Ukrainian people is to lose their country to Russia. Is that possible? Can that happen?
I mean, we can't predict how this is going to end, can we? And so all we can do is watch these events unfold and do everything we can to support Ukraine and to rally the global community around Ukraine. That is what we can do at this point. And I think it's really important to focus on what the global community can do, right? From that point of view, we already saw We saw the CARICOM statement condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, followed shortly by the UN General Assembly, that resolution that Sarah mentioned earlier. All of these efforts are really, really important to make it very, very clear to everyone who is watching, whether Bahamian or Putin himself, that this is not acceptable.
Hopefully he is watching. Madam High Commissioner, worst case scenario if Russia is able to take over Ukraine completely, what does that mean for world politics? How now does the dynamic change?
So I think one thing that my Prime Minister's said on a couple of occasions is we do need to be a bit careful to speculate outcomes. But I think we can all agree that this conflict and the fact that Putin believes he can redraw countries' borders through military aggression, we need to make sure that that's not normalised, that there isn't some kind of acceptance that Russia, just because it's powerful, just because it's a military might, can redraw the borders of the countries that it feels should be part of Russia for whatever reason. And I think the working together to make sure that that is not internationally legally acceptable has to be one of the tools in our armoury to tackle this.
You know, to come a little bit closer to home. In the 60s, Russia had very strong ties with Cuba, started under the Kennedy administration. And is the U.S. concerned that Cuba may still be sympathetic towards Russia?
Well, I guess that's a question for me. Frankly, I don't see that as a huge concern right now. I don't know if you know, but I served in Cuba in my diplomatic career, and I spent 2.5 years there. And frankly, even back then, the Russia presence was very, very limited. They basically withdrew the majority of their support to Cuba after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this prompted the very, very difficult special period in Cuba where life was very, very hard for Cubans. So I don't think that's a particular concern, but I do believe that this confrontation between that Russia is forcing on Ukraine there are regional ramifications to this. There are things we can do regionally. I'm very proud that the Bahamas took an early and strong stance against the invasion. That was very important, and I hope to see the Bahamas continue that kind of leadership, because all of us do have a part to play in this, in helping bring this to an end.
Some Bahamians have said to me outright, "But why should we get involved? I mean, that's a conflict between Russia and the Ukraine, and if the U.S. and the UK wants to get involved, that's up to them. They're bigger nations. They have the firepower. They can defend themselves. What can this little country do with a population of just over 300,000? I mean, what does it matter if we oppose this or if we support sanctions?"
So I suppose I look at it this way. If there was a bully in the playground beating up the weakest kid, are you the sort of person that joins in with the bully? Are you the sort of person that helps the vulnerable victim who's being beaten up? Or do you just walk on by? And does it make a better world if you say it's nothing to do with me and we just walk on by? And I believe that actually the things that the Bahamas has been saying and the way it co-sponsored the resolution in the UN, it makes a massive difference. And people who say this has got nothing to do with me, we talked about this already. Well, your pump price is going to be higher, your food prices are going to be higher. So, in fact, all of us tackling it together is really important, because otherwise there will be implications that go on until we get this fixed. So, you know, I think you can look at it from that perspective.
Madam Chargé, I've got to put the same question to you. You know, Bahamians, I hear them in conversations in passing, and sometimes you see the comments even on social media, this is not our conflict, why are we involved? But the United States has asked the Bahamas and has applauded, I think, the steps that we've made.
Yes, we absolutely have. And, you know, more generally, apart from the steps that the government has taken, which I commended them for, I'm also been very gratified to see Bahamians discussing this issue. You know, everywhere from the barber shop to the grocery shop, you know, I overhear Bahamians talking about what's going on, why is Russia invading Ukraine, what can we do to stop this? I mean, I do think that one thing I've come to appreciate the Bahamas is they do love their freedom of speech. They love their democracy, right? And I think Bahamians, as a relatively new democracy, understand the pride that Ukrainians feel in their own democracy. So I don't actually think that there's any reason why Bahamians wouldn't feel relevant to this global dialogue that's going on right now. They've proven that they are relevant, that they do have things to say, and that they understand that there's a grave transgression taking place in Ukraine right now.
As we prepare to wrap up the discussion, I do want to ask both of you this. What is the lesson here for the world in all of this? At some point, historians are going to analyze everything that's taken place from the build-up right through to the end of the conflict, whenever that is. But what is the lesson you think for the world in all of this? And, you know, when you look back at the two world wars, the Korean War, there are lessons that we are still, I think, benefiting from in some ways, some things that we have learned. But looking even now at this early stage, what do you think the lesson for the world will be at the end of this conflict?
So it almost sounds like a PhD thesis, that one, but I do think it's a really important point to raise, because what we've learnt very quickly is that if we work together, if we tackle this together, if we stand firm with our values, we can get 141 countries to sign up to a UN security resolution overnight. I mean, that's quite significant that the world is in a space where it can do that and act so quickly. We're also seeing that this situation is evolving, and every day a country does something that it's never done before. So Germany has been providing military defensive aid to Ukraine, because this is so serious and so important that the paradigms are changing, the way people act are changing, and individuals have done different things. I have heard as many Bahamians say that they're worried about the consequences. I've heard other Bahamians saying they're doing things, that banks are changing the way they invest, they're changing the clients that they have, lawyers as well. So I think action is happening and people are responding in an appropriate manner given the gravity of the situation.
Right. So a couple of things you asked about, kind of the historical perspective, and I think about my parents, who were, of course, the World War II generation, and that whole generation of people around the world, they went through this grave conflagration that consumed the world and could have ended it. And they have an appreciation for the blessings of democracy that I think little by little we tend to lose sight of. Mm-hmm. You know, we're leaving behind those generations. And so then something like this happens, and it's almost a wake-up call. It's like, look, it's a reminder. Freedom is not free. You have to fight for it. You have to defend it. And I think that is exactly what's happening right now. And frankly, in my career, I've served in countries that were not free. And once you are living that reality, you are very, very sensitive to it. So when I watch what's going on right now, where the possibility of a free Ukraine is called into question, I really, my heart goes out to them. I can't think of a worse situation to have to face.
And you're right. It is a wake-up call. And it is something that I think is giving all of us pause for a moment, to think that at this stage of our development, of the progress that we have made, we are still back at this point where people are having to defend basic human rights. And so you're right. I think that's a good place to end. Ladies, it has certainly been a pleasure to have this discussion. We are at the end of our show. You have been an extraordinary guest for us this evening. We thank you so much for joining us, providing the insight. I know whenever you are speaking in this role, there's always so much to consider, but you all have done a great job in representing your country, so thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And I hope at some point I can bring you back on.
Thanks for hosting us.
Yes,
Paul.
thank you.
Appreciate it.
Certainly has been my pleasure, and thank you for coming on. Our topic tonight, Russia invades Ukraine, a diplomat's perspective. Our guests, Sarah Dixon, the British High Commissioner, and Usha Pitts, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires. Join us again next week for another topic that directly affects the lives of Bahamians. Until then, for the entire team, I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. We'll see you next time.